Hello, Zen. Thank you so much for joining me for this Writer's Mosaic podcast. You're a Malaysian expat living in Britain. Can you tell us a bit about your upbringing in Malaysia and the impression you formed of the UK in your childhood?
Yeah, so I grew up as a member of the kind of substantial Chinese minority community in Malaysia, mostly in a town called Petaling Jaya, which is a kind of satellite town outside the capital of Kuala Lumpur. And we spoke English at home. My parents had both attended schools that were taught by British monks slash nuns, depending on their gender. And I read a lot of British fiction growing up, whether that was Jane Austen or Enid Blyton or Terry Pratchett. And actually one of the things I think of as being most influential in my development as a writer was my parents getting, a membership of the British Council Library, a card for me. And they used to drive me the hour or so to the library each weekend so I could stock up on reading material. And they did that when I ran out of things to read at the KL Children's Library. So it was an interesting upbringing that, I was reading all these British novels, which were generally, in settings and kind of about people that I had very little to do with in real life. And, they never reflected the kind of setting I grew up in. And so I think my overall perception was really that, only white people were allowed to be in books because that was kind of all the evidence that I saw. And yeah, and that's kind of part of what drives me today when, in my writing.
I get the impression that historical Britain, the Britain of Jane Austen, was almost a secondary fantasy world for you as you were growing up. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's a fair thing to say, yeah. I mean, I don't think, obviously that was intensified by the fact that I was growing up in a different country and a different culture. But Diana Wynne Jones, the children's fantasy author, she wrote an essay once talking about, giving her son the book Kim by Rudyard Kipling and finding out when he finished it that he had read it as a fantasy, not as historical fiction. Or, well, it wasn't even really historical fiction at the time Kipling was writing it. And so I think given my age, because I was reading these kind of Victorian novels and Georgian novels relatively young, kind of in my early teens. They did read as kind of secondary fantasy. Although obviously I knew they weren't fantasy as such. I knew they were taking place in a historical period of our own world. But I enjoyed them in much the same way that I enjoyed fantasy.
And all this is directly relevant to your debut novel, Sorcerer to the Crown. Can you give listeners who've not had a chance to read it yet the elevator pitch for that?
Sure. It's a novel about Zacharias Wythe, who is England's first African sorcerer royal in Regency Britain. And he meets a plucky orphan girl who has made a discovery that will blow apart English magic. Basically. And my really quick pitch for it, depending on the audience, is either it's Jane Austen with magicians and people of colour, or else it's Edward Said crossed with Georgette Hare, who wrote these wonderful Regency romances. Edward Said wrote Orientalism, of course.
What drew you to the Regency in particular? I ask because fantasy readers, or even people who are only familiar with fantasy from afar, are accustomed to medieval or pseudo-medieval settings for fantasy.
Well, Regency fantasy, or what we call fantasy of manners, is actually a fairly established subgenre in its own right. So Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke is probably one of the most famous examples. Naomi Novik wrote a very popular and successful series called the Temeraire series, which is essentially Age of Sails, the Napoleonic War only fought with dragons. And there are other examples. So I was kind of following, a hollowed tradition. What I was really inspired by was these Regency set romances by Georgette Hare, a very popular author, albeit in a different genre. And yeah, because of what we spoke about earlier about the kind of connection between historical fiction and fantasy, it felt very natural to take that setting and then just add a bit more fantasy to it.
And empire is an important theme both in Sorcerers of the Crown and in the next book in the series, The True Queen. Empire's not an uncommon theme for SFF. Why do you think that is? And how did your knowledge of imperialism both in the real world and in SFF influence the direction the novels took?
Well, I think the answer to the first question is that SFF likes kind of big stakes, saving the kingdom, the destruction of the galaxy. And so having a kind of big empire fighting a kind of plucky underdog works quite well for that. I think the other part of, there's lots of different answers to the question of why empire is so central to a lot of SFF. But I think another answer is that a lot of it was written or conceived historically by American writers. So Star Wars is kind of really classic example of, science fiction, kind of science fiction, space opera, where you've got that big empire and people fighting it. And so I think Americans like this idea of themselves as, it's part of their kind of historical narrative, their story of themselves, that they were fighting the British Empire. So that, I think, enters their fiction. For me, the kind of role imperialism played in my life was total. I grew up in a country that would not have the demographics it has now, if not for imperialism. It was profoundly shaped by imperialism. My ancestors would not have come to Malaysia if not for imperialism. I wouldn't be living in the UK if not for imperialism. So I wanted to write, when I was writing these novels, I wanted them to be kind of fun and entertaining, but I also kind of wanted to think a little bit about that. And I would say that the message in Sorcerer to the... Well, one of the things that I'm saying in Sorcerer to the Crown, the True Queen, is, sure, I and the colonies are maybe a product of... The ex-colonies are a product of imperialism, but so is Britain. And so is all this historical fiction or these books that I read growing up, whether that's Jane Austen or Georgette Hare or the like, all these... This whole kind of idea of the Regency and, these kind of, this genre with the kind of pretty frocks and the gentlemen and so on, that all was kind of profoundly implicated with imperialism.
I hope some of our listeners who are not normally fantasy or science fiction readers might be tempted to try your work after they've heard this interview. But will you speak a little to the role of fairy, magic and other elements of the fantastic in your work? Why do you infuse your writing with speculative elements rather than just write straightforward mimetic fiction?
There is a short answer, which is I don't know. That's how it came to me. That was what the idea was like, when I started writing. There are lots of different potential answers. I think in the context of Sorcerer to the Crown specifically and the sequel True Queen, when I started writing Sorcerer to the Crown, I got the idea, actually. It was from my kind of childhood reading. And one of the things that used to really puzzle me when I was reading these old British books growing up, Enid Blyton, for example, is that they would describe characters as being dark. But then, and in my context, if you said someone was dark, you meant dark-skinned. But I knew that in books, like, everyone was white, so that really confused me, and it took me a while to work out that what they meant was dark-haired. And so I had this idea, as a grown-up looking for a book to write. I was like, wouldn't it be funny if you wrote a book in kind of that setting? I know Enid Blyton is a bit later, but in a kind of historical setting in Britain, and the main character was dark, but he was dark-skinned, and how would that affect the story? But I knew I wanted to write something that was really fun, that was kind of all the balls and all the banter and all that, like, all the kind of fun of the Regency romance genre and the fantasy genre. And I wanted to give my main character, Zacharias, a certain amount of status and amount of power. So his position, although it is threatened, is not precarious in the book because he is Sorcerer Royal. He's got this important title. And the reason why he is in that position is because he's got magic. So to me, kind of magic was almost a way of equalizing, this kind of historically unequal position, and kind of, I guess, putting a couple of my characters who are people of color in a position where they can kind of infiltrate the British establishment and kind of access some of the privileges attached to that.
Can you, just to build on that a little bit, can you speak about your approach to racism in these books? Because even though the African and Indian characters do have power, which they wouldn't necessarily have had in the real world, and indeed people who were living in London at the time didn't, this is not a colourblind approach to casting. The racism that they experience is real. Can you speak about your experiences of dramatising that?
Yeah, well, I wanted it to be a fun book, but I also wanted it to feel real, emotionally real, even if it's a book that features dragons and people flying around on clouds. I think you can have all that kind of bullshit in a book, but then have it still have like emotional resonance and feel emotionally real to the readers if you keep some things true to life. And one of the things I thought was important to keep true to life was to show that, it's a fairly light-hearted novel, but still, as people of color, these characters do face racism, and they do face issues due, for example, to their class status as well, and that that affects their relationships with those closest to them, because they both grow up essentially as kind of third culture kids. They're kind of international adoptees. They're brought up by white people, and I thought, I wanted to kind of show that even in these kind of very close relationships, you could, racism was still an issue, and it was still something that they experienced that the people immediately around them might not understand, really. So that was important to me.
In the novels, you use this wonderful period term hag-ridden to mean tormented, but then in your latest novel, Blackwater Sister, you take this metaphor very literally. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the original title of Blackwater Sister was hag-ridden because I just thought this was such a great word. When I was writing Sorcerer to the Crown, I spent a lot of time on the Oxford English Dictionary website, like online, looking up these archaic words. The reason why I did that was because I was building a version of our world, historical world. And I wanted readers to feel that they were in a real kind of magical version of our world. And I thought if I used these words that had fallen out of common usage, they'd have a kind of robustness to them because they were real words. But at the same time, they'd be kind of foreign and exotic, and they kind of create that sense of being in a different world. And so that's how I came across hag-ridden as a word. And I just, it's such an amazing word. And immediately I had this idea of the story about a young woman who was being ridden about by, a hag, her terrible ancestors. And that led to Blackwater Sister, which is about a young woman. She's grown up in America, but she's returning to Malaysia, which is where her parents are from and where she was born, when she starts hearing a voice in her head, and that's the voice of her deceased grandmother, who has very strong ideas about what she wants her granddaughter to be doing with her life. And they involve ghosts, gods, and gangsters.
Does your approach to Malaysian magic differ from your approach to English magic? And does that speak at all to differences between how Malaysians read fantasy fiction and how the genre tradition exists in the UK or US?
My approach does differ as between, writing English magic versus Malaysian magic, because my sources of inspiration are different. So with English magic, I wrote about it in Sorcerer to the Crown, and that was drawing a lot of inspiration from my reading, from other books that feature magic in an English context, whether that was like Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or just kind of general fairyland myths, or Hope Merleys wrote this wonderful book called Blood in the Mist. But with my depictions of Malaysian magic, either I make something up, which really puzzles actually Malaysian readers, because quite a lot of my short stories are studied by university or secondary school students in Malaysia, and periodically I will get emails saying, where is this myth from? And I'll have just made that up. But I also do draw on folklore, on Malaysian folklore. And that's not something I learned about really from books, although I do have books about Malaysian mythology and folklore. That's the kind of thing that people just talk about and believe, so Malaysian superstitions form a lot of my inspiration. I don't know that it speaks to any difference in how Malaysian readers read fantasy, because if you're reading fantasy novels in English, you have been taught to read fantasy novels in English, if that makes sense. Like, if someone is reading Blackwater Sister, it's very unlikely, in Malaysia, it's very unlikely that that's the first English language fantasy novel they've read. So they'll have read other examples of genre, most of which I guess are more kind of conventional to that idea of what fantasy is.
So, although you're very successful as a fantasy author, you also continue to practice law. Can I ask whether lawyering influences your writing, and equally, whether writing has made you a better lawyer?
I don't know if writing's made me a better lawyer, in the way that if you've got more than one thing to do. So there's kind of a saying about when people become parents, they often just become much more efficient at work. I don't know, maybe this is kind of wishful thinking of parents parents having wishful thinking, but certainly it's something that a senior lawyer said to me once. So, women who go away and have children, they become, much more efficient after they come back from maternity leave. And so in that sense, perhaps, I do feel that I became a lot more efficient and kind of worked out, these are the things in my job that I need to do, and these are the things that aren't as important once I started publishing in a kind of serious way. At the same time, I do less of the lawyering because I found I had to go part-time really in order to sustain a publishing career. In terms of how lawyering has influenced my writing, though, there's a couple of ways. The most important way is that being a lawyer as my day job brings in various things that I don't get via writing. So it brings in money. Consistent money is one thing. I do earn money via writing, but it's much more inconsistent and hard to predict and hard to plan for. It also gives me a chance to kind of work in a team, a kind of consistent external validation, kind of an objective framework for achievement, all these kind of really boring sounding things that actually are quite important to my well-being. Another way in which it's influenced my writing, I don't often see many kind of synergies between them, but I struggled for a long time to make the leap from short fiction to longer form because I was writing short stories and I just couldn't really grasp how I would go from writing a 5,000 word short story to a 100,000 word novel. And then I was working on a case where, and this was when I was a trainee lawyer, where I was being supervised by a senior associate who was drafting this witness statement. It was one of these massive financial cases. And so there were loads of documents. And the witness statement basically functioned as a way to put these documents into evidence, present them to the court in a kind of coherent narrative. So what it was a continuous story, a very boring story, but a story. And it was 80,000 words long, right, which is a novel. And I saw this being written essentially by one person. And I thought, oh, okay, so that's how you write. That's how you write a narrative that runs that long. With great effort over a long period. But it kind of made something click for me. And after that, I kind of, it helped me kind of on that way to kind of writing novels.
Last but not least, who would you recommend our listeners check out when they finished your novels?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I always recommend Karen Lord, who's this wonderful Barbadian author who writes, I would say, kind of literary SFF. So her style is quite literary, but it's quite funny as well. It's very funny, intelligent. She wrote a wonderful book called Redemption in Indigo, it's not too long, and it's a kind of retelling of a Senegalese folktale in a way that kind of draws inspiration from Caribbean kind of oral storytelling, and it's great. That's one book I would definitely recommend. I'm trying to think of what else people might enjoy. I think if you like that kind of Sorcerer to the Crown style fairy story and want to read more, I will recommend Hope Merley's Blood in the Mist, which is relatively obscure, but one of those kind of cult classics within fantasy. I think it was written in the early 20th century, and it's a kind of fairyland tale, and beautifully written. Actually, now I'm talking about it, I want to go back and reread it.
Well, Zen, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me for this podcast.
Thanks for having me.